In accordance with Standing Order 43, the time for members' statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My questions to the Prime Minister. Last year, average wages for Australian workers rose by only 2%, but corporate profits rose by 20%. So when ordinary workers are already doing it tough, why is the Prime Minister slugging millions of workers with a $300 tax increase at the same time as giving away $65 billion to big business?
Yeah.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition, as usual, is seeking to mislead us, talking about the level of company profits. The reality is the figure that he's using is one massively inflated by the commodities boom, a once-in-a-generation boom. But the Treasurer will have more to say about that, because what we need to focus on today is the fact that the Labor Party, who poses as the alternative government, has not one policy that would create one job or encourage one business to invest $1. He wants to impose $165 billion of new taxes. He seems to think that somehow or other it would be good for employment if business owners are forced to pay more taxes. We know that more than half of Australia's workforce work for small and medium family businesses with turnovers up to $50 million a year. They are not gigantic businesses. And you can hear the Labor benches scoffing at that. They really, I'd say to the Leader of the Opposition, he should encourage his team to get out more. Find out who the workers in their electorates actually work for. They're working for hard-working, Australian-owned family businesses, and they have been investing their earnings, their after-tax earnings, for years to grow their businesses and create more jobs. I was with one in Brisbane the other day, the Eckersley Print Group, a classic example of that. And they are being encouraged by our small and medium enterprise tax cuts to do more of that, and they're responding. Last year, the Leader of the Opposition went to the Press Club and he said that this year, 2017, he was going to be talking about jobs, jobs, jobs. Well, he didn't talk very much about it other than his own job, but what we saw was 403,000 jobs created in Australia, 3/4 of them full-time. The biggest contribution coming from those small and medium family-owned businesses, Australian businesses. They are the very businesses that the Labor Party wants to impose higher taxes on. And they purport, or they claim, to come here and say they're for jobs. What do they really think the response of a family-owned business, a small or medium business, is going to be when a Labor government imposes higher taxes? They'll cut back, and I tell you what, Mr Speaker, they'll cut back on jobs. Wherefore jobs Labor's seeking to destroy.
The member for Latrobe.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is also to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on how the government's plan for lower taxes will grow the economy, create jobs and increase wages, including in my electorate of Latrobe?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the honourable member understands very well that the jobs of his constituents depend on businesses having the confidence to invest and to employ. He understands that, as do all of our colleagues on this side of the House. I think some of the Labor side understand it too, but they're being dragged off to the left by the Leader of the Opposition. Off he goes with Jed Carney seeking to win the by-election in Batman. Now, Mr Speaker, everything depends on a strong economy, our ability to pay for health, our ability to guarantee Medicare, our ability to deliver, for the first time, national consistent needs-based school funding, a massive increase in school funding, and for the first time consistent, so that a school with the same needs in one part of the country will get the same funding as a school in another. The honourable member opposite calls out rubbish. I'll tell you what was rubbish. The rubbish was when the Labor Party shamelessly appropriated David Gonski's name and claimed that their dog's breakfast
Members on my
of
left.
inconsistent, contradictory school funding policies was somehow or other the Gonski model. We accepted David Gonski's recommendations, and that's why he stood with me and the Minister for Education when we announced our schools policy. Mr Speaker, what we know is, with a strong economy, we get more opportunities. It is our economic plan that we set out in the budget is delivering that growth. 403,000 jobs, 3/4 of them full-time. Overwhelmingly, you're seeing small and medium businesses, the ones that are benefiting from the tax cuts Labor so opposed so strenuously and is now committed to roll back. Those businesses are responding with confidence, offering Australians the opportunity to get started in the workplace. He talks about jobs, or claims to. We delivered jobs, 403,000, the largest number in our history in any given year. That is an achievement of giving Australians the opportunity to get ahead. And what does Labor have to offer us? Billions of dollars of taxes, $165 billion of tax imposed on companies, on businesses, large and small, imposed on investors, imposed on families. Every dollar of those taxes designed and determined to crush incentive, discriminate against hard-working Australian businesses and put Australians out of work.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. The government has legislation in the Senate right now to increase personal income tax for 7 million working Australians. Can the Prime Minister confirm that the government's legislation will mean that a worker earning $60,000 a year will pay $300 more in tax every single year, yes or no?
The Leader of the House will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, he wants to know yes or no. What about, did the Labor Party fund the National Disability Insurance Scheme? No! Were they fair dinkum to Australian families with disabled children? No! Did they deceive them? Yes! The Labor Party claimed the credit for the National Disability Insurance Scheme. They came to the opposition. They came to the opposition led by the member of Warringah, and they challenged him and our side of politics to support an increase in the Medicare levy to go towards funding the NDIS. And we supported it because we knew that Australians wanted a National Disability Insurance Scheme, and Australians expected that the government would put in place the measures to fund it. That's what an honest government does. That is what a government does that is fair and fair dinkum. And there is nothing fair about saying to the parents of disabled children, well, the money won't be there in the future. The funding isn't in place. The Labor Party, Mr Speaker, failed the Australian people. They failed to put in place the funding that was needed to support the NDIS. And now, in their hypocrisy, they want to oppose that responsible measure which will ensure that Australians get the support with disabilities that they need. It is a great national enterprise, and you would think that a party as old as the Labor Party, and one that has held government in this capital on so many occasions, would rise to the occasion and recognise that that great national enterprise should be funded. It's honest, it's fair income. Sadly, the Labor Party of today is anything but that.
Member for Lyons. The member for Grey.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on why it is important to lower the tax burden to support more and better paid jobs for hard-working Australians, including those in my electorate of Grey?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Grey for his question. As he knows, the Turnbull government has already delivered lower taxes for 3.2 million small businesses in Australia today, employing some 6.5 million Australians. That's half the Australian workforce and more, for businesses with a turnover up to $50 million a year. Tax cuts that I noticed that for businesses above $2 million and up to $50 million, the Labor Party will reverse if they ever get back to the Treasury benches. They will remove those small business tax cuts for hard-working small businesses across Australia. And those tax cuts already delivered has been part of the plan that has supported job creation in this country. 1,100 jobs created every single day and more last year, Mr Speaker. The job growth that we have seen in our economy over the last 12 months in calendar 2017 is unprecedented. Jobs growth is so strong, Mr Speaker, in this country, I notice even Sam Dastyari got a job this week, Mr Speaker. Now, Mr Speaker, these companies that will get the tax cuts next are not multinationals. They're not big companies. The next cab off the rank for companies to get a tax cut under our enterprise tax plan are companies of between 50 and 100 million a year in turnover. They employ 500,000 Australians and on average have around 200 workers. But as the member for Grey knows, they can be companies with as few as 30 employees, which includes Hunt Fuels in Jamestown in the member's own electorate. They are suburban businesses. They are regional businesses. These are businesses that the Labor Party are lined up to deny a tax cut so they can pay their workers better wages and invest more in the future of their business. The member for Barker knows about Angove Family Winemakers, a fifth-generation family winery based in Rentmark that exports South Australian wine products across the world. He wants them to get a tax cut. The Labor Party says no to that business, Mr Speaker. The member for Adelaide, by contrast, though, wants Nobles, an Adelaide-based manufacturer of lifting and rigging equipment with 300 Australians employed in their business. She wants them to pay higher taxes, not lower taxes under our plan, as they seek to ride out the transition from the mining investment boom. The member for Macon wants Alexa Medical Lasers and his electorate to pay higher taxes. Now, this is an innovative laser technology company based in the electorate at Mawson Lakes with nearly 200 South Australian employees. How do they think that forcing companies to pay higher taxes will help them deliver wage increases from Australians, Mr Speaker? You know, if you had to choose between a company run by the Leader of the Opposition or the Prime Minister, which company do you think would be more profitable and able to pay their workers more, Mr Speaker? There's no question. You wouldn't trust the Leader of the Opposition to run a company, and you wouldn't trust him to run the country either.
The Treasurer's time has concluded. The member for Sydney has the call.
We wouldn't let you get the milk.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Wages growth for workers is stuck at record lows. Why is the Prime Minister asking Australians to believe that his $65 billion big business Trump-style tax cuts will trickle down to ordinary workers?
Yeah. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the opposition either have the memory of a goldfish or they think that everybody else does. Go back to 2011 and some remarks in the House of Representatives. Cutting the company income tax rate increases domestic productivity and domestic investment. More capital means higher productivity and economic growth and leads to more jobs and higher wages. Who was the economic genius that said that? Who was it? It was the member for Maribyrnong, the Leader of the Opposition. It was. It was. Look, it wasn't that long ago. It really wasn't that long ago. And, Mr Speaker, everything that's said here gets written down. You see? That's what they've overlooked. They thought it just vanished in the breeze. No. More capital means higher productivity and economic growth and leads to more jobs and higher wages. It may be the member for Sydney does not find her leader entirely convincing. Could be that. But he was, to be fair, only quoting economic orthodoxy and common sense. And of course, in the previous year, the member for Lily's budget, paper number 1, said, and I quote, "Cutting the company tax rate will make Australia a more competitive destination for investment." What an insight! He goes on, greater investment in capital will support higher productivity
member for Rankin.
and real wage increases for Australian workers.
Member for Rankin is warned.
In current terms, the member for Lilly went on in the budget, in current terms this reform dividend is equivalent to an extra $450 a year in the pocket of a full-time worker on average weekly earnings. And, Mr Speaker, he went on in his budget speech. He didn't just leave it in the fine print. The member for Lilly said, "Our key business tax reforms will increase real wages by about 1.1% in the long run, putting an extra $450 a year into the pockets of workers on average earnings." Mr Speaker, all of that was a penetrating glimpse of the obvious. It is plain that if you give companies the incentive to invest more, they will do so. When they invest more, just as the Leader of the Opposition said on the 23rd of August 2011, it will lead to higher productivity, economic growth and more jobs and higher wages. I refer the honourable member to her Leader's economic lesson of some years past.
The member for Mayo.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Indigenous Affairs. Approximately half of Indigenous Australians in remote areas live in overcrowded housing, with some 3-bedroom homes containing 17 occupants. In contrast, only 5% of non-Indigenous Australians live in overcrowded housing. Will the Minister please provide the reasons why the federal government has abandoned the National Partnership on Remote Housing, which will mean a shortfall of $24 million for South Australia and $483 million nationally? Defunding will inevitably lead to more overcrowding and even poorer health, social and educational outcomes for remote Indigenous communities. Minister, how can this be closing the gap?
The Minister representing the Minister for Indigenous Affairs.
Can I thank the member for her question and her interest in this particular issue? It is a matter of priority for our government and certainly has been part of a priority that has been the focus of a remote Indigenous housing agreement for the past 10 years. The negotiations that are occurring between states and territories that are part of this remote agreement require ministers from the state and territories to also equally commit and match Commonwealth funding, because the funding that we've provided to South Australia last year was $430 million for mainstream housing or general housing, but over the last 9 years in South Australia they have received $3.3 billion. And the point you make about reducing overcrowding has been a result of that continued partnership, and we've seen a reduction of 15% in overcrowding in the 4 jurisdictions that are affected: WA, South Australia, Northern Territory and Queensland. The funding has not been cut, it has not been reduced. Senator Scullion is in ongoing negotiations with the relevant ministers, and sadly Zoe Bettison has so far refused to put any money on the table as part of those bilateral discussions. And that is important because there is a need to consider all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as part of the citizenry of each jurisdiction. And equally, there is an obligation for state and territory governments to also come to the table and make their contribution in the same manner that they do for mainstream. The remote housing report has certainly identified another 5,500 housing need in all jurisdictions. But if we are to address that, then there must be equal partnership between the jurisdictions and the Commonwealth, because the impact of housing is beyond just accommodation. It goes to the social determinants in which housing provides the opportunity for shelter, but also the same trappings that we would expect to find in any home within our country. And Senator Scullion, my colleague in the other chamber, is continuing to have ongoing discussions with the relevant ministers with a view to seeking to put into place an agreement that is jointly agreed to but equally shared in meeting the needs of Indigenous Australians within those 4 jurisdictions, so there is not a cutback in Commonwealth funding.
Members on both sides. The member for Chisholm has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry. Will the minister advise the House how company tax cuts will assist the defence industry and encourage the creation of more and better paid jobs? Why is it important to have a consistent approach to policy?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Mr Speaker, I thank the member for Chisholm for her question. As the member for Chisholm well knows, the Turnbull government's support for defence industry extends right through to research and development, through, for example, the Defence Innovation Hub. Just in January, I announced grants of about $13.5 million to 5 different companies through the Defence Innovation Hub, one of which was Darrenmont Technologies, in the member for Chisholm's electorate, who received $8 million to help create a prototype radar capability for the Australian Defence Forces, Mr Speaker. So the government is supporting defence industry in many different ways. One of them is research and development, but we're also supporting defence industries in Australia through things like corporate tax cuts, by lowering the company tax rate in order to give businesses the chance to invest in their own businesses, to create jobs, to create growth, to create higher wages, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, one economic guru said back in 2012, as Australia is buffeted by economic events overseas, we understand that lowering corporate tax assists the creation of jobs. What can be more important in this country than the creation of jobs? Does that sound familiar, Bill?
The Leader of the Opposition will refer to members by their correct titles.
I apologise, Mr Speaker. I'll refer to the Leader of the Opposition.
The Manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat, Speaker. And you're warned.
I accept the warning, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition—
The Leader of the House will resume his seat for a second. I'm going to remind him again on the use of correct titles, and it really doesn't bother me whether he accepts the warning or not. He's warned.
Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition would know those words because he spoke them himself in 2012. Because what we've seen from the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker, is a complete inability to maintain a consistency to policy development throughout his political career. He's well known for his policy elasticity, Mr Speaker. But this stands in stark contrast, Mr Speaker, to the member for Grayndler. The member for Grayndler, Mr Speaker, one of his gall-lighters was at work in the Australian today. He was saying, I better use his correct title, the member for Grayndler's greatest strength is he is the member for Grayndler, Mr Speaker. In other words, the member for Grayndler has always been of the left, and he's never made any pretence about it. And I was reminded of those scenes from The West Wing, Mr Speaker, when the President's advisers used to say, "Let Bartlett be Bartlett," Mr Speaker. But imagine if the Leader of the Opposition's advisers said to the Leader of the Opposition, "Let the Leader of the Opposition be the Leader of the Opposition," Mr Speaker. The reality is the Leader of the Opposition wouldn't know which one he was going to be. He wouldn't actually recognise himself, Mr Speaker, because he's changed sides so often. He's had so many policy positions. He's been on so many different sides of the Labor Party. He wouldn't know how to let Shorten be Shorten.
You'll need to come to the dispatch box and withdraw.
I withdraw, Mr Speaker.
The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Speaker, just briefly, last year there became a pattern of government ministers saying things they knew were out of order for the purpose of getting a grab up, and then withdrawing and sitting down as though it was the first time they'd ever heard that that was a mistake. And I simply ask that this year it not be allowed to be repeated.
I thank the Manager of the Minister for Health will cease interjecting. He's not assisting. Okay. I thank the Manager of Opposition Business for his point of order. I think that the point is well made, and I think the Leader of the House knows he's right at the edge of the cliff. The member for McMahon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Last night on Q&A, the former head of the Australian Industry Group and former RBA board member Heather Ridout decried the government as cowards on economic reform and said its $65 billion company tax cut was polarising. With company profits up 20% last year but wages growth only at 2%, why is the government pitting business against employees by giving the top end of town a tax cut and increasing taxes on ordinary Australians by $300 a year?
The Treasurer.
Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. Now, I wasn't watching Q&A last night. That might come as a surprise to many Australians, and particularly those at the ABC. I'm sure they're disappointed. But I understand there are a number of guests on Q&A last night, and one of those was Chris Richardson, Mr Speaker, and this is what he had to say about company tax cuts. He said the smaller the economy— I was reliably informed. The smaller the economy, the bigger the difference you can make through company tax cuts. And he said this: if the world's money investment comes here and works here, then we get a better result. And he said 2 out of every 3 of those dollars would show up in higher wages. Mr Speaker, that's Chris Richardson. Now, they may not be persuaded by that. So I think I'll go to Professor Holden, the good friend of the member for Fenner and fellow wedding guest and all the rest of it. I assume the member for Sydney didn't get an invitation to that wedding because she obviously is not as close to Professor Holden, but he made a very good point in referring to an excellent study from Europe, from Germany, and he said this: cutting the Australian company tax rate from 30% to 25% is not just good for business and workers, it also helps reduce economic inequality. Surely this reform is something that deserves across-the-board political support when it comes before the parliament this year, Mr Speaker. What he found was, Professor Holden, referring to that study, is the people who would benefit from this would be women. They'd be people on lower incomes. Now, that's not the work of the coalition, Mr Speaker. That is the work of a serious study done over 12 years in Germany, which was looking at tax changes in various state jurisdictions and federal jurisdictions over more than a decade. And they concluded, Mr Speaker, that if you lower the tax burden on business, they respond and they invest more in their company, they grow and they pass on. Now, a very important point is made about looking what has happened to company profits over the last 5 or 6 years. And it is true that in that last 12 months period, Mr Speaker, when you look at the GOS, the gross operating surplus, which is the effective measure of company profits, in that last year, there was a strong improvement, and that was off the back of commodity prices and for mining investment firms. What the Leader of the Opposition seeks to represent is this was broadly based across every business in the country. What he doesn't tell you, in the 5 years before that, the average growth in that figure was actually negative. So for 5 years, hard-working small and medium-sized businesses sweated it out in a tough economy, foregoing income themselves to pay their workers and to keep them in jobs. And the Leader of the Opposition comes in here and diminishes their sacrifice, and he says it's worth nothing, Mr Speaker. Absolutely nothing. This is an opposition, a Labor Party that sneers at small business and medium businesses, Mr Speaker.
The member for Page has the call.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister for Infrastructure and Transport. Will the Deputy Prime Minister outline how the coalition government's record $75 billion investment in infrastructure is providing job opportunities in communities across Australia, particularly in my electorate of Page, and is he aware of any alternative approaches?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question, and he has done a superb effort in the seat of Page in making sure there's substantial investment in infrastructure, and it goes beyond the work he's done on smaller projects such as mobile phone towers and bridges to renewal and roads to recovery, and making sure that the casino sale yards are upgraded. It goes to the major projects as well. And to see that in the members' electorate we are now a part of the upgrade of Woolgoolga to Ballina, which is part of in excess of a $3 billion investment, in excess of a $3 billion investment, $3.46 billion, and it's well needed as well. Because it builds on the work that was formerly done by Warren Truss and John Howard to make sure that we have a vision for this nation, a vision of a dual carriageway road, of a divided road that goes from Melbourne to north of Gympie, and we are working on that all the time. In the members' electorate, Mr Speaker, we will see 2,500 direct jobs and 7,500 indirect jobs. That's 10,000 jobs. 10,000 jobs that the member for Page has been part of that investment, driving that investment forward, making sure that Page is part of a vision for our nation in this great Pacific Highway, linking up with the Bruce Highway, and ultimately driving forward to the pavement widening right up to St Lawrence. And what we see on our side is always a vision that takes in regional Australia. It's great to see this morning the Regional Investment Corporation that has now been voted for is now through. A great win, and we look forward to moving that into a regional town. Obviously, we want to get it into Orange to make sure that we drive that part of our regional agenda forward. But of course, the Labor Party, we're always waiting. We're waiting for their view on regional Australia, what they're actually going to do in regional Australia. And maybe if we have a future by-election in Longman, I don't know why we would have one of those, but maybe if we have a future by-election in Longman, and it's great to see the member for Sydney giving a few election tips to the member for Longman to try and help out in a future election that will be happening there. And what will be very interesting if there is a by-election in Longman is whether the rhetoric for Longman is anything like the rhetoric for Batman. Because we know in Batman we've got the left fighting against the far left, and maybe some of that left versus the far left we can replay in a future election in Longman. But what we have to also recognise, of course, in this is in the support for regional Australia, because I think the people of Longman need someone who they know absolutely is entitled to sit here, is that we've got to work out whether we can actually trust people. And it was the member for Maribyrnong, who stood here and said that everything was under control. Well, the only way something will happen in regional Australia is that if you remain on the opposition benches.
Members on my left, the member for Cowan, the Leader of the Opposition.
My question's to the Prime Minister. Medibank Private has a return on equity of 26%. That's about double the return of even the big banks. At the same time, private health premiums are at record highs. Why is this government giving big private health insurers a big tax cut instead of supporting Labor's plan to cap private health premium increases to 2%?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition knows full well that many of the people he used to represent as a trade union official are members of smaller employee-based health insurance companies. And he knows that APRA pays the closest attention to the solvency and the prudential management of all of those health insurance companies, but naturally particularly the smaller ones. And when he came out with his thought bubble to unilaterally cap the premiums of health insurance companies, he saw the reaction from the industry, which was that this would put the solvency of so many of these insurance funds, particularly the smaller ones, at risk, put them at risk of bankruptcy. And what does he then say to one of his former members, who's a member of one of those funds? And I think, Mr Speaker, we'd find many members opposite are members of them. What does he say to them then? When they get sick and they're off in hospital with big bills, private hospital bills, and the insurance company's gone broke. What does he say then? He says, oh, well, I had my thought bubble. I thought I'd just cap the premiums without any regard to what APRA said, without any regard to the viability of the industry. The reality is this. The Leader of the Opposition hates business. He's seeking to declare war on business, but he hates private health insurance even more. He went to the press club and he wasn't prepared to stand up for the private health insurance rebate. He wasn't prepared to do that. He was crab-walking back to a favourite Labor field to undermine private health insurance, undermine choice, and the consequence of that would be nothing less than more and more pressure put on the public health system and, in particular, the public hospital system. The Leader of the Opposition will not fool us or the Australian people. His target is business and its private health, its private hospitals and its choice. He is determined now, the most left-wing leader of the Labor Party we've seen in generations, to move his anti-business, anti-investment, anti-jobs agenda. Well, Australians won't be fooled by that. They know that 403,000 jobs last year is the growth you see with strong economic leadership, and they won't be putting that at risk for his left-wing populism.
The member for Dunkley.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Revenue and Financial Services. Will the minister update the House on the importance of creating a tax setting that helps grow the economy and reduces the tax burden on hard-working Australians? Is the minister aware of any alternative approaches that pose a threat to Australian small businesses and families alike, including in my electorate of Dunkley?
The Minister for Revenue and Financial Services.
I'd like to thank the member for Dunkley for his question. As a former small business owner, he knows that the best generator of jobs is businesses. The best generator of incomes is businesses. And when we see businesses thrive, we see them invest more and create more jobs for Australians to be employed. This is precisely why the government has legislated tax cuts for small and medium-sized enterprises. And, Mr Speaker, the results for this are very compelling. More than 400,000 jobs created in 2017. That's over 1,000 jobs created every single day. And we have seen the results this morning from the Australian Business Confidence, and seeing that this is actually at its highest point since December in 2010. But not only does Labor want to keep business taxes high, they will actually increase business taxes on small and medium-sized enterprises with a turnover of between $2 and $50 million. Now, these are businesses that are employing millions and millions of Australians that have already either received a tax cut or will be receiving a tax cut on the 1st of July this year under the Coalition. Now, the Leader of the Opposition was on the record recently at the National Press Club proclaiming, in his usual self-righteous fashion, we are in danger of creating a left-behind society. Mr Speaker, what a very interesting choice of words, given the reckless stance that he has taken on tax and the direct threat that this poses to businesses and workers across our great nation. Thanks to the Leader of the Opposition, we are in danger of being left behind by the United Kingdom, that has reduced their company tax rate to 19%, soon to fall to 17%. We are in danger of being left behind by the United States, that has reduced their rate to 21%. We are in danger of being left behind by France, Italy and Belgium, that have either reduced their rates or announced an intention to do so in the future. Now, the importance of ensuring that our tax settings remain competitive should not come as news to the Leader of the Opposition, because, as the Prime Minister has quoted him, he has said that it leads to more jobs and higher wages. Mr Speaker, the Turnbull government, the OECD, the IMF and governments of various political persuasions from all around the world all recognise the economic benefits of reducing company tax rates. It's Labor's opposition to the government's enterprise tax package that would see Australia be left behind on business investment, on jobs, on growth, damaging our economy and harming the prosperity of millions of Australians.
The member for Jagga.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Social Services. How many Australian families are currently worse off because of the government's 2-year freeze to family tax benefits? And why is the government putting big business before Australian families with their unfair $65 billion company tax cut?
The Minister for Social Services.
I'd like to thank the member for her question. And can I say that this government is about supporting families. This government is about ensuring that families get the assistance and the support that they need. And we are doing that through our economic policy. And our economic policy is delivering for this nation. The best thing that we can do for mums and dads, for individuals, is to make sure that they can get a job. And we're delivering 1,100 jobs a day to help those families. Now, it's funny, when you start off in a new portfolio like this, you decide to do a bit of research. And it was funny because when the member for Jagga moved 80,000 single parents onto New Start, when she moved 80,000 single parents onto New Start, she had this to say. And I thought, well, some might see that measure as having been a bit harsh, but this is what she said. Unfortunately, we have far too many people, children growing up in Australia in families where nobody is working. The more that people go back to work, the better. It's better for the family, it's great for the kids to see mum or dad or both going to work. That was the member for Jagga, and I thought that's incredibly sound. So I thought we would see support. We would see support from the opposition to what we are doing to create jobs, because the best thing that we can do for families, for individuals, is to make sure that they have a job so they can support their kids, to make sure that they can give them a good education, to make sure that they can provide the health care they need. And that is what we will continue to do through the good, sound economic management of the Treasurer, supported wholeheartedly by the Prime Minister and everyone here, building on the great work done by the previous member for Social Services, by the previous member for Human Services, who both did an outstanding job in making sure that we can deliver for all Australians.
The member for PETRIE.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. Will the minister please outline to the House how the coalition government's trade agenda is creating more and better paid jobs for Australians? Is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Trade.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for PETRIE for his question. Another member of the coalition that's absolutely steadfastly wedded to making sure we open up export markets for Australian small businesses and wedded to the types of trade outcomes this government has delivered consistently over the past several years. And I note, having visited the member for PETRIE's electorate, a great local business in his electorate, Packer Leather, which supplies, among other products, leather for Kookaburra cricket balls. They of course also supply the iconic Sharon footies. They also supply footy boots for soccer players and of course the iconic R.M. Williams boots. That leather often comes from Packer Leather as well. So a great example, championed by the member for PETRIE, of a business that is succeeding now. We saw under the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement that the 14% tariff on kangaroo leather exports is eliminated over 4 years. Now, this gives them unprecedented export opportunity into the world's second largest economy. And it's outcomes like that and what it means for jobs in the member for PETRIE's electorate that underpin why we pursued the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement and underpin why we pursued the TPP-11. And it's not like everyone's agreed with us. Both on the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement and on the TPP-11, the obstacle that stood in the way was the Australian Labor Party. The people who kept naysaying the TPP-11 and the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement were the Australian Labor Party. And so when the member for PETRIE asks about alternative approaches, well, there are some. I couldn't help but notice that Jed Carney, Labor's candidate in Batman, said this about the TPP-11. Trade agreements like this are pin-ups of the failed neoliberal experiment. The Turnbull government should abandon this deal. I mean, this is the kind of rhetoric—
Is that the Green candidate?
No, not the Green candidate, and it is a very loony left type of comment, but that's where the Australian Labor Party is today. As the Prime Minister has outlined, the fact is that the few rational economists on that side, and I'm slightly terrified I'm going to be asked to point one or two of them out, but the few that were there, they've lost the war, Mr Speaker, because the Australian Labor Party has been dragged to the loony left now, and it's people like Jed Carney who describe trade deals like the TPP as being a failed neoliberal experiment. They're the ones that call the shots now. You know what she said about Chapter? Jed Carney said Chapter would be a job-destroying deal. But what we've seen under the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement and what we'll see under the TPP-11 agreement is a commitment of the coalition to growing exports, to growing investment, to growing jobs. And the only people that stand in the way of us achieving that success is the Australian Labor Party and their loony left trade agenda.
Members on both sides. The member for Jagga has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question again is to the Minister for Social Services, and I refer to his previous non-answer, as it's around 1.5 million Australian families that are worse off. Isn't it the case that a family with a household income of $60,000 a year with 2 primary school-aged children will be around $440 worse off because of his freeze to family tax benefits?
The member for Corangamite. The member for Corangamite will cease interjecting. The minister has the call.
I'd like to thank the member again for her question. And I don't want to start in this portfolio by getting into tit-for-tat discussions with her. But since she's come back, again, I'm going to have to point out that the paid parental leave threshold was first paused in the 2011-12 budget for 2 years. Who was in there? Now, I'm still a bit new in this portfolio, but I'm trying to remember who was in government then.
Who was the minister?
Well, who was the minister?
Who was the minister?
Was it the minister who said this? Unfortunately, we have far too many people, children growing up in Australia and in families where nobody is working. The more that people go back to work, the better. It's better for the family, it's great for the kids to see mum and or dad or both going to work. Was it the minister who moved 80,000 single parents onto New Start? Was it that minister? I mean, I can keep going, but what I want to say to all of you,
Members on my
there's
left.
other examples, member for Jagga, of where you froze payments. There's other examples. So what I will say is on this side, we are about positive policies which will help people be able to get work, earn incomes, look after their kids, provide for their families. That is what we are about. And we are going to deliver for those families by producing a strong economy, by making sure we continue to have job growth, to make sure that people, as was mentioned before, like Sam Dastyari, when they lose their job, can find another one. We are going to make sure that we can continue to do that. We are going to build on the work that we are doing so that every Australian who has the opportunity to do so will be able to get work and support themselves.
The member for Fisher.
My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the minister update the House on why strong borders are a necessary part of our national security framework? Is the minister aware of any risks to Australia's borders?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the member very much for his question. I was up on the Sunshine Coast with him just before Christmas in a round table with the local police looking at issues that would make the local community there safer, and I commend him for all the work that he does in his local community. Mr Speaker, this government's very proud of the fact that we've been able to stop the drownings at sea. We've not had a drowning at sea since, now for over 3 years, coming up to 4 years. We've been able to close 17 detention centres. We've been able to get every child out of detention that Labor put into detention, and we have been able to stare down the people smugglers. Now, we don't take that for granted because we know, Mr Speaker, that the people smugglers have not gone away. They are still there in Indonesia and Sri Lanka and Vietnam and elsewhere, preparing to put people onto boats this very moment. Now, the Leader of the Opposition scoffs at that because he doesn't believe that there is a threat, and he can't hold a consistent policy when it comes to border protection. And all Australians know that if you can't secure your borders, you can't provide for a safe and secure community. Now, the Leader of the Opposition is seen as shifty and dodgy by the Australian people because he is. Because he is, Mr Speaker. Now, he promised one thing to one audience, something to the next audience. He will tell whatever group of people he's in front of what they want to hear. And the problem is this great dilemma that the Leader of the Opposition has at the moment with the by-election in Batman and the prospect of one in Longman is that he would have to tell the people of Batman, a trendy left-leaning seat, he would have to tell those people in Batman that he was going to walk away from this government's tough border protection policies. The trouble is, when he got off the plane in Queensland and went up to Longman and was up in Caboolture, he'd have to say to those people up there, and I noticed a member for Longman's busily involving herself in conversation about some made-up topic next door to her, but the problem is that in Longman, the people there strongly support strong borders. And the real dilemma for this Leader of the Opposition is that he would be caught out telling one thing to people in Melbourne and something different to people in Brisbane. But this would come, Mr Speaker, as no surprise to the Australian public. The Australian public has this bloke pegged. I'll tell you who else does, Mr Speaker. Member for Grainler. He is getting ready to go. This bloke is biting at the bit, Mr Speaker, because he knows that this Leader of the Opposition is propped up by the union bosses. I acknowledge the CFMEU workers up in the gallery today, the true champions. There you go, mate, throw your arm up. Out on building sites, breaking arms, carrying on. They give millions of dollars to the Labor Party, and they own and control. They own and control this bloke 100%.
Has concluded. Members on both sides will cease interjecting. The member for Isaacs will pause for a second. The member for McEwen is warned for earlier interjections in the answer. And I say to the minister, I caution the minister about discussing matters with the public galleries. The member for Isaacs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm he said today about multicultural Australia, and I quote, "The key foundation of our success is mutual respect," unquote. Does the sharing of racist and bigoted material, including from extreme right-wing hate groups like Britain First, present a threat to the mutual respect the Prime Minister referred to earlier today?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the honourable member knows very well that the government and every member of the government and our party has absolutely zero tolerance for racism. That is now, Mr Speaker. I want to say this: that we in this nation enjoy extraordinary freedoms. And yesterday we were at the Australian War Memorial at the last post ceremony, recalling that that place of quiet contemplation and remembrance, which we can see across the lake, remembers and honours the sacrifice, the supreme sacrifice of over 102,000 Australians who fought to defend our Australian values. And I want to remind the honourable member, that in this parliament, on both sides, there are men and women who have served Australia in our uniform, putting their lives on the line to defend those values. They haven't just defended them, they've fought for them.
The member for Corangamite. The member for Corangamite has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Regional Development, Territories and Local Government. Will the Minister outline to the House how the government's regional jobs and investment package is unlocking jobs and economic opportunity for communities across the nation, including those in my electorate of Corangamite? Is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches that would threaten the jobs of hard-working Australians in regional areas?
The Minister for Regional Development, Territories and Local Government.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for her question, and I share that with the House that it was fantastic to join the member for Corangamite and the Prime Minister in Geelong just a few weeks ago to announce the successful recipients of the Coalition Government's Geelong Regional Jobs and Investment Package. Yeah. Now, there is no more relentless advocate for their community in this House, no more passionate supporter of regional jobs, regional growth, local businesses than the member for Corangamite. And this is why it was so pleasing to announce these transformational projects for her local community. Mr Speaker, after an extensive assessment process involving strong community input, 21 projects totalling $20 million will be delivered in the Geelong region, providing residents with a wider range of job and employment and, of course, investment opportunities in the future. Some 600 new jobs generated in the construction phase, a further 600 jobs ongoing, is proof that 600 families will confidently invest and spend more in the Geelong region. Now, this program is all about the government coming together with private investment to leverage significant investment in local communities. $20 million from the coalition government, in this case, will leverage a total investment pool of some $95 million. That includes support for Lamont Composites to build Australia's first next-generation carbon fibre manufacturing facility that the Prime Minister was attending as well. This is truly a transformational project for the important regional area. Equally important to the Colac community, the support for the implementation of the Lake Colac Master Plan. Significant importance there in relation to improved amenities, community infrastructure and drawing on more tourists, as we saw with Councillor Joe McCracken. Now, all of this adds, Mr Speaker, to the record 403,000 jobs in the last 12 months delivered by the Coalition. 120,000 jobs came from regional Australia. Now, what are the threats to this approach? Those threats sit opposite, Mr Speaker. We're delivering for regional Australia. The interests of regional Australia are simply a niche issue for the Australian Labor Party. The Leader of the Opposition's political opportunism knows no bounds. The Batman by-election will be the coalface once again, where the opposition says whatever it needs to say at the expense of regional Australia, simply to appease inner-city Green voters. Unlike those opposite, Mr Speaker, the Coalition, many regional members of the Coalition and the great Liberal and National parties are standing up for regional Australia. We want to see that jobs and growth.
Time has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. My questions to the Prime Minister. I refer to the given that the Prime Minister has just said every member of the government has absolutely zero tolerance for racism, Will the Prime Minister direct Senator Molan to act according to the Prime Minister's stated zero tolerance for racism by taking down the racist and bigoted material that he's sharing?
Hear, hear. Members on my left, the member for Griffith has already been warned. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr. Speaker, Major General Jim Molan has just this week joined the Senate. He defended Australians' values in the battle against Islamist terrorism in the Middle East. He has stood up for our values, put his life on the line, led our troops and our allies' troops in conflict. He has led thousands of troops in the battle for freedom against terrorism. The Leader of the Opposition wants to describe him as a racist. That is deplorable. It is disgusting. Jim Molan is a great Australian soldier. We are lucky to have him in the Senate. He doesn't have a racist bone in his body. He has stood up for freedom. He's stood up against terrorism. He's stood up against extremism. He and thousands of others like him are the reasons we enjoy the freedoms we're practising in this chamber.
Has the Prime Minister concluded his answer? Prime Minister's concluded his answer. The member for Forrest has the
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Law Enforcement and Cyber Security. Will the Minister update the House on the importance of keeping our kids safe online? What action? This is important. What action is the Australian Federal Police taking to help educate children and parents about cyber safety?
Members on my left, the member for Rankin has been warned. He continues to interject. He can leave under 94A, and those that have been warned will follow him if they interject again. It's ridiculous. I can't even call the minister to answer the question. The minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member, who is well known for her long-standing and keen interest in ensuring that all Australians, especially young Australians, are kept safe online. Mr. Speaker, most
the minister
parents—
will resume his seat. The member for Lyons will leave under 94A. I don't like to give character assessments, but he might like to reread the Leader of the Opposition's speech at the Press Club about this being a better year. The minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Most parents would be rightly shocked by the reports that emerged from the Australian Federal Police today. The AFP is seeing cases where children as young as 4 have produced sexually explicit material, uploaded it on social media and subsequently engaged with online child sex offenders who may well have encouraged the initial upload. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, that in the digital age we face real risks on every phone and every computer, and children are now engaging independently online from extraordinarily young ages. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that everyone in this place can reflect on the incredible aptitude of younger Australians with mobile devices. They have quite literally grown up with the technology. That engagement can be a great thing, but our law enforcement, our policies, our education of our children must keep up. That's why the AFP has broadened the scope of its training to ensure that our youngest and most vulnerable Australians are protected. Now, Mr. Speaker, the AFP has for some time expanded, or for the first time now, expanded their Think You Know cyber safety program to children in kindergarten through to Year 2 and to their parents. That's why it is also why the Turnbull government is committed, like no previous government before it, to strengthening our national cyber security against those absolutely deplorable threats. The government's cyber security strategy, which was launched in April 2016, sets out an ambitious 4-year plan to secure Australians online, and it's just one of our many reforms to national security legislation, policy and funding, the most significant reforms
in a generation. And with the creation of the Home Affairs portfolio, we're now better placed than ever to deal with the complex national security threats. The sad truth, Mr Speaker, is that those threats can now reach into every home and every schoolyard, aided by technology and sophisticated criminal networks. As with every other aspect of national security, only the coalition government can be trusted to keep Australia's digital borders secure.
The Manager of Opposition Business has the call.
That was low rent, did you know it?
The Manager of Opposition Business has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. Given the nature of the previous answer on indulgence, I can associate the opposition with the first part of that answer.
Manager of Opposition Business has the call.
Thank you. My question is to the Minister for the Environment. Yesterday, the minister said allegations that Adani tampered with scientific evidence in relation to the spill of coal-laden water on the sensitive Callie Valley wetlands were a state matter. Is the minister aware that the very federal conditions he spoke about yesterday impose direct responsibility for the federal government concerning the Callie Valley wetlands? Given the minister in fact has direct responsibility for these wetlands, when will the government investigate and will it report publicly?
Hear, hear. The Minister for the Environment.
Well, Mr Speaker, it must be my lucky day because as Environment Minister I waited 566 days for a question and now I've had 2 in 48 hours, Mr Speaker. Now, Mr Speaker, yesterday the Shadow Minister for the Environment, the member for Watson, was referring to an issue related to Abbott Point Terminal. Now, as the Shadow Minister knows, Abbott Point Terminal was constructed before the EPBC came in. And as a result, the primary regulator for that is the Queensland Government, Mr Speaker, is the Queensland Government. And we know why Adani owns the Abbott Point Terminal, and that is because the Bligh Labor government sold it to them, Mr Speaker. And we know why the Bligh Labor government sold it to them is because they support the Adani project, Mr Speaker. They support the Adani project. Now, Mr Speaker, the member for Watson knows this is a state matter, that what he is referring to is the primary regulatory authority and responsibility of the Queensland Government. But do you know why he has now come to the dispatch box to ask this question, Mr Speaker? It's because of the by-election in Batman, Mr Speaker. It's because in Batman, they have a candidate, Jed Carney, and now Jed Carney and the Carneyistas, Mr Speaker. The Carneyistas are in control of the Labor Party. Now, Mr Speaker, those opposite used to support the Adani mine. Mr Speaker, who said the following? On the 12th of April 2017, I support the Adani coal mine, Mr Speaker. None other than the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, who said, and I quote, I welcome the jobs that it will provide in Queensland, Mr Speaker. None other than the member for Shortland, Mr Speaker. Who said the following? Adani is a massive project and it's got the potential to create thousands of jobs, which will be fantastic for regional Queensland, Mr Speaker. Labor Senator Murray Watt, Mr Speaker. And who said the following? The Adani is a vital project as an economic opportunity for our region, Mr Speaker. Labor Senator Anthony Chisholm, Mr Speaker. So the reality is that the Labor Party supported the Adani project. But now, on the eve of the Batman by-election, Jed Carney and the Carneyistas are now writing the Labor Party's policy. And this should not surprise us from the Leader of the Opposition, because he famously said, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there, Mr Speaker. And if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. So the Leader of the Opposition doesn't know if he supports more jobs in Queensland, or in fact he does know now he doesn't support more jobs in Queensland because he doesn't support the Adani project, all because he's placating the Labor left in order to win the seat of Batman.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Speaker, I seek leave to table the environmental approval from 2013 to Adani Abbott Point Terminal, which specifically regulates the Callie Valley wetlands where the coal spill occurred.
Is leave granted? Leave is not granted. The member for Flynn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Agriculture and Water Resources, and I congratulate him on his elevation to the front bench. Will the minister update the House on the state of the agriculture sector in Australia and how coalition government policy has encouraged more and better paying jobs for hard-working Australians? Is the minister aware of any alternative approaches? Thank you.
The Minister for Agriculture.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And can I thank the member for Flynn, who's a real fighter for the people of Flynn. And I was fortunate enough to visit his electorate and go across the length and breadth of it and talk to his farmers behind their kitchen tables and have a look at the innovation that takes place on their farms. And I was fortunate enough to meet with Smart Berries in Mundubra, a town of 1,000 people, but they employ up to 500 people at the height of their picking season, which is a huge influx into a community like that. But when I sit at their kitchen table and I talk to them, they tell me the most important thing to them are the trade agreements that we've put in place that are allowing them to put their product right around the world, allow them to get into markets that they don't have at the moment. The free trade agreements that we've done with Japan, Korea and China, and now with the TPP, if only we had some support from the other side. But I don't know where that's going to come, because the tinfoil hat approach to trade in this side of the House is something that's going to hold back agriculture. This is something that will drive growth and jobs in regional and rural Australia. And it's not just at the farm gate that gets the returns, it's the small communities that support those farms. I can tell you it's from St George to Blackbutt down to Colac. Those are the communities that take advantage of the free trade agreements. We're putting the framework and the environment around our farmers to invest back in their farms. Complement that with the tax cuts that we're giving them, the real tax cuts that we know, because these people on our side, we've employed people. We know what it's like. We know the pressure of what it's like.
The member for Shortland.
Have to come up with the wages of your employees on a Friday afternoon, the stress and strain. And you know what? And then let me tell you, the reality is there's a strain and stress, but if you give that opportunity and you put that money back into those small businesses, they invest back in their small businesses. They invest back into their communities. And we're also putting the infrastructure around our farmers with the telecommunications of the 21st century, the mobile phone black spot. Never before have we seen an investment of $200 million in the tools of the 21st century that our farmers need. As we went around, as the member for Flynn and I went around, we heard day after day about the huge advantages that the mobile phone black spot has put into regional and rural Australia. We believe in the 320,000 Australians that are employed by agriculture. But the thing that worries me, that only a week ago in the National Press Council address, the Leader of the Opposition did not once utter the words agriculture. Not once could he say agriculture. So God help those that work in agriculture and those in regional Australia if the Leader of the Opposition ever becomes Prime Minister.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice, please.